Thank you for the very kind introduction, and also to our hosts for inviting me here. It's a real honor to join you to talk about such important issues. I'd like to begin with a story, and it comes from being at a similar session to this. The robotics industry trade group a couple years ago gathered its leaders. The trade group is called the Association for Unmanned Vehicle Systems International. And so it gathered its leaders in a place much like Trondheim, San Diego, California, very similar weather. And they were gathered for some institutional soul searching. Now, the reason was that this robotics trade group had come a very long way in a short amount of time. Their group had been formed in 1972 in Dayton, Ohio, arguably the home of manned flight. And it had begun with just a couple of US Air Force officers and defense contractors who were interested in robotic aircraft, drones, unmanned aerial systems, whatever you want to call them. They formed in 1972. They held their first meeting in a small conference room in a motel that could fit 12 people around the table. Now, since then, that robotics trade group has grown to having over 1,500 member corporations, not just members, but member corporations and chapters in 55 different countries. They don't hold their conventions anymore in small motel rooms. They actually hold it in large casinos in Las Vegas. If you want to attend the next one, it's at the Mandalay Bay Casino in Las Vegas. So it was because of this massive growth that the leaders were gathered to figure out something important. And what they were trying to figure out is, what is the story of robotics? That is, what is the narrative? What is the story that they were going to be telling the rest of the world about what they do, but also what do they tell their own members about what they do? And they took this idea of story so seriously that the moderator for this conference that brought together the leaders of the robotics industry wasn't an executive from one of the companies, wasn't a scientist, wasn't a general. They actually hired a professional storyteller to come in and teach them how to tell a good story. As one of the members said, what we have to figure out, quote, is where have we come from, where are we now, and where should we, and where do we want to go next? And I think that idea, those questions, are something that occupy most of us here today. And so what I'd like to do is walk you through what I think are at least some of the most important parts of the story of robotics. Now, it's at this point where a number of the military folks in the room go, oh my goodness, he's not going to be using a PowerPoint. Do I really have to listen to a talk without a PowerPoint? I can't do that to you. I know you would go through withdrawal systems, but I'm going to give you hopefully let's see if this works here, a different kind of PowerPoint. It's going to be something that plays behind me, because every good story needs pictures, but I'm not going to speak to it. It's just going to play behind me as they go through, showing you the visual side of the story of robotics. That is, what you're going to see are robotic systems from around the world. I'm not going to speak to them. They're to show you the visual. They're secondly, to show how this is not science fiction that we're talking about. And third, to give you something interesting to look at when you get tired of looking at me. But so, to pull back on all of this, the book that I wrote called Wired for War is about how there's something big going on in the overall story of war and technology. The US military that went into Iraq had a handful of unmanned aerial systems supporting it, drones, remotely piloted aircraft, whatever we want to call them. We had a handful in the US military inventory. The force that went in on the ground utilized 0 unmanned ground vehicles, ground robotics. The US military now has more than 8,000 in the air and more than 12,000 robotic systems on the ground. Last year, to give you another sense of the sea change that's going on, the US Air Force trained more unmanned systems operators than it trained manned fighter plane and manned bomber plane pilots put together. Now, it's important to remember when we're talking, though, about the Predator, or when we're talking about the PackBot that you see there, we're talking about the first generation. We're talking about the equivalent of the Model T Ford or the Wright brothers flyer. We are still at the horseless carriage stage of this revolution. Even the terms we use to describe it, unmanned system, horseless carriage, what they're not rather than what they truly are. But that's where we're at right now. peering forward, one U.S. Air Force lieutenant general said to me that many people are surprised when they find out that we have thousands of robotic systems in our military today. But the next major conflict, quote, it will involve tens of thousands. But these numbers matter in a different way, because it won't be tens and thousands of these ones that you see beside me, or very soon the prototype ones, because there's another number that matters when it comes to technology. It's Moore's Law that you may have heard of. Moore's Law is the idea that for the last 40 years, we've been able to pack more computing power into our microchips, into our computers, into our robotic systems that were powered by them, such that they basically double in their power and capacity just about every 18 months. I can give you a better illustration of Moore's Law. It's one of those holiday greeting cards that you may have received that opens up and plays a little song. If you've ever received one of those holiday greeting cards from your kids, you held more computing power in your hands than the entire US Army had when my father served in it, and that one single holiday card that you likely threw away. Now, what happens if Moore's Law holds true over the next 25 years, which is supposed to be the period that we do our strategic planning for? If Moore's Law holds true over the next 25 years, the way it's held true over the last 40 years, our chips, our computers, and the systems that are powered by them will be 1 billion times more powerful than today. I don't mean 1 billion in sort of the way we talk about 1 billion in American defense budget circles, 1 billion here, 1 billion there, who cares? I mean literally multiply their power with a 1 and 9 zeros behind it. Now, Moore's Law is not a law of physics. It does not have to hold true. So what if technology slows down? What if it just advances at 1/1000th the rate it has historically? That means within 25 years, our technologies will be just a mere 1,000,000 times more powerful than today. Is that in any way, shape, or form incorporated into our strategic documents? The point here is the kind of things that we used to talk about at science fiction conventions like Comic-Con are now something that we're wrestling with at the Pentagon. What is it like to live, work, and fight through a robots revolution? Now, it's at this point I need to be very clear. When I say robots revolution, I'm not here warning you that the Metal Masters are coming for you. I'm not telling you to watch out for the Robo-Apocalypse, which is a movie that Steven Spielberg is filming right now. I'm not here to warn you that the former governor of California is going to show up at your door, all of the Terminator movies. Much like the movie, he's actually filming he's working on a new Terminator movie. It's apparently going to be about an elderly robot in some way. But what I'm talking about here is that when it comes to technologies in war, every so often one comes along that changes the rules of the game. Now, revolutions are often misunderstood and definitely oversold in military circles. We saw that particularly with the concept of network-centric warfare. It was wrong both in terms of its definition and its very subject. That is, no technology, no matter how advanced, can lift the fog of war, as a former American defense secretary once said. Nor will, I think, historians care that military units went from using fax machines to using email. I do think they will care that humans went from fighting inside our machines to outside our machines. That is, networks do matter in war, but as enablers. Networks are not the end of the story. But go back to that very definition that I said. Revolutions are defined not so much by their capabilities, but by the questions they force upon you. They force questions of possibilities. Things that you didn't imagine you could do just a generation earlier, now you can. But they also force questions of what is right and wrong, issues of propriety that you didn't imagine you'd be wrestling with just a generation earlier. Now, the historic comparison that people make to the robotics revolution, I think, illustrates this. Many of the scientists that I talked to made that parallel I said before to the automobile around 1912, 1913, or the horseless carriage as it was known back then. Now, what's interesting is that in that period, for example, Ford Motor Company was selling just a couple hundred of them a year. But why did the automobile become important in history? Well, of course, Ford went from selling hundreds of them to millions. But it's also bigger ripple effects from it. We saw the mechanization of society, the mechanization of war. We saw changes in geopolitics. Everything from a group of desert nomads at the time were lucky enough to live over what was considered a nuisance, this black sticky stuff that came up from the sand. But because they lived over that, they moved into a fairly powerful position in geopolitics, to global climate change, literally changing the planet itself, to changing our cities. There was no such thing as the concept of suburbia before the horseless carriage, just changing social relationships. In English, we have the concept called dating. Teenagers couldn't go out on dates before the horseless carriage. If they wanted to interact with someone from the other sex, they had to court on their parents' front porch. The automobile gave them freedom. This new technology, though, led to new questions, new need for rules, what we called traffic laws. And the new laws required an understanding of this new technology. In America, for example, the first traffic laws entailed that someone was supposed to walk in front of an automobile with a flag to warn people that the automobile was coming. And when they got to an intersection, if they wanted to make a turn, they were supposed to fire a flare gun into the sky. That made perfect sense in a world that moved at 6 or 7 kilometers per hour. It didn't make sense in this new world. Other people make a different comparison. Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft Computers, he makes the parallel, understandably enough, to the computer, but around 1980. Now, if you think about the computer around 1980, it was a big, bulky device. The computer could do only a limited set of functions. The military was the main spender on computers research and development. The military was a prime buyer of computers. But very soon, the computer gets more advanced. It gets smaller. It can do more things. The military moves out of being in the dominant position. We get to the point that we stop calling computers computers anymore. So for example, I drove here from the airport in a vehicle that had over 100 computers in it. We don't call it a computerized automobile. The same thing is starting to happen in robotics. So for example, if you buy a new Ford, Toyota, Mercedes, etc., they come equipped with technologies that in English we call parking assist or crash avoidance. These are very nice ways of saying robotic elements to the car, because we humans, we don't parallel park very well, and we often don't look in our blind spot, and the robotic car takes over these jobs for us. But again, why is the computer important in history? It's not because I don't have to memorize long division mathematic tables anymore. It's all of the change that we've seen. We see, for example, billions of dollars made and lost in nanoseconds. We see changes in security, the idea of cybersecurity, cyber war, fighting in a place, cyberspace, that didn't exist a generation ago. We see changing social relationships. I can become friends with someone in China that I've never met before. On the other hand, I may be concerned about my niece becoming friends with someone that she's never met before. Finally, this example of computers illustrates how bureaucracies have a very tough time dealing with technologic change. So for example, in the United States, the Secretary of Homeland Security is supposed to be in charge of our cybersecurity. She still doesn't use email today. A disconnect. Final comparison that people make is a striking one. They make it to the atomic bomb, and this works in two ways. One is the idea of the cutting edge of the field. If you were a young scientist in the 1940s and you wanted to work on what was exciting, what was hot, where the awards were to be won, you worked in nuclear physics. You were drawn to that field. Much like today, if you want to work on what's exciting, what's hot, if you're in computer science, engineering, you're drawn to robotics. It is the cutting edge. But the worry that many scientists and ethicists have is that much like what happened to those scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project and then went, what did we just do? That we will be creating a genie, a robotic genie, that we can't put back in the bottle. The point that I'm making here is that when we gather to talk about a technology, we often focus on how it works. But what history cares about are all of the ripple effects that come out of that technology. Ripple effects on doctrine, ripple effects on politics, ripple effects on law and ethics. And that's what fascinates me. And so what I'd like to do in the remainder of my time is walk through what I think are some of the most important ripple effects. Now, the first one of these, as you saw, is the ripple effect of the marketplace itself. Our robotic systems that we've grown comfortable with, actually, the first generation looked like the man systems that they were replacing, even down to, for example, having the cockpit literally painted over. What we're seeing now, though, is a proliferation of their sizes, their shapes, their forms. Everything from large-scale systems with wings the length of a football field, designed to stay in the air not hours, not days, but literally months and even 7 to 10 years. To, as was mentioned, teeny tiny systems. So we have, one measured in grams out in Afghanistan today, to I was at a U.S. Air Force research lab where I saw one that would fit on the tip of a pencil. The design is taking, as you see, lots of other inspirations. The second fundamental shift is something that we haven't seen in warfare when it comes to comparing weapon system. Their intelligence, their autonomy. Now, I'm someone who is very much interested in World War II history. So the way I think about this is comparing generations of aircraft. The Norwegian pilots at the start of World War II were equipped with the Gloucester Gladiator, a biplane, the best last of its breed. I'm talking about the Gladiator, not the F-35. By the end of the war, they were using the Spitfire. Now, when we compare the Gladiator to the Spitfire, we would say things like, well, the Spitfire was better because it was faster, it could fly further, it could carry more armaments. That's a very similar comparison that we would make between the MQ-1 Predator and the MQ-9 Reaper. The Reaper is better because it can fly faster, it can fly further, it can carry more armaments. But it's also something else that we would have never compared previous generations of weapons. It's smarter, it's more autonomous. Now, the Reaper isn't the Terminator, it's not out there making its own decisions, but it can do things like take off and land on its own, fly mission waypoints on its own. It carries smart sensors that can make sense of what they're seeing. We now are adding target recognition software. And again, this is something new. But Reaper's where we're at right now. Already testing in the US is the X-47 UCAS, which moves us from having the pilot in the loop, a remotely piloted aircraft, to having to ask what happens as we move on the loop, as US Air Force documents describe. That is, the X-47 can not only take off and land on its own, but do things like air-to-air refuel on its own. Take off and land not just from airfields, but from aircraft carriers. Carry out mission sets on its own, like ideally penetrating enemy air defenses. We're moving from in the loop to on the loop of decision to maybe even out of the loop of decision. Now, from this, we're seeing an expansion in the user base and functionality. To use an early generation of these systems, as was mentioned, you had to be a trained pilot. Now, you can fly some of them using an iPhone app. I think of the comparison to computers. When I first used a computer, I first had to learn a new language to communicate with my computer. Not French, not German, not Norwegian. It was called BASIC. And only when I learned that language could I communicate and use my computer. Today, my 3-year-old son can operate his iPad without even knowing how to type. And it's not that the computer is simpler, it's actually more advanced. It's doing more and more on its own. And so what we're seeing is the opening up of the set of users. So for example, one study found that non-trained pilots actually operated unmanned aerial systems better. They had lower crash rates. But most important in this opening up of the user space is something we don't often talk about in the military, the civilian side. So in the United States, for example, in the year 2015, which sounds really far off, but it's actually not all that far off, our civilian airspace will be opening up to unmanned aerial systems on the civilian side. It's been ordered by our Congress. Now, what that means is that we open up the marketplace. I was at a defense company that makes drones for the US military. They're doing rather well, but that means they have one primary client out there. When this airspace opens up, they believe they'll have 21,000 new clients. That's the number of local and state police departments in the United States, many of whom that either have very expensive police helicopters or can't afford very expensive police helicopters. This company sees this opening up to the netherworld of not public law enforcement, but we have things in the United States, strange things like border militia. One of these militias down in Arizona is flying its own private border patrol using drones, to the use of private investigators. As one New York City divorce lawyer put it, quote, "If the Israelis can use drones to find terrorists, certainly a husband is going to be able to track a wife who goes out at 11 o'clock at night and follow her." to environmental monitoring using drones, to lifeguarding, to journalism. We've seen journalists already use drones to monitor natural disaster, flooding that we had in the United States, to the negative side of journalism. We have what are called paparazzi, these journalists that chase stars. The head of the largest paparazzi agency said he's buying drones to, quote, strike fear into the heart of any celebrity who dares to have an outdoor birthday party. And finally, recreational use, where, for example, you might use a drone to capture footage of your kids playing a football game, combining current systems right now that are both easily available, a Parrot drone, which is a couple $100, with an HD camera, an amazing technology. On the other hand, I, on the other side of that football game, may be completely annoyed by it. The point I'm making here is that as you open up new users, new markets, it leads to another impact, another ripple effect. While this is a robotics revolution, it is definitely not, and I think this conference illustrates, just an American revolution. In warfare, there is a rule that also carries over to technology. There is no such thing as a permanent first mover advantage. So for example, how many people in this room ever used a Commodore or IBM computer? Just raise your hand if you know ever used them. Okay, how many of you are still using your Commodore or IBM computer? The same thing holds true in war. The British, for example, invented the tank, got the idea from an H.G. Wells science fiction story about land ironclads. But of course, as you know your history, the Germans figured out how to use the tank better. So today, the U.S. is very advanced in robotic technology on the military side. We should be. We spend so much, roughly half of all the defense spending in the world is American. But there are 76 other countries that are also building, buying, and using military robotics today. And they range from our close allies, like Norway, UK, France, to certain countries of concern, like Pakistan, Iran, Russia, China. China, for example, has gone in the last 5 years from displaying no unmanned aerial systems at their weapons trade shows to, at the last one, displaying 25 different models of unmanned aerial systems. But just like what happens in the rest of warfare, states are not the only game in town. As in software, warfare is going open source. That is, this technology is unlike an atomic bomb or unlike an aircraft carrier. You don't just need a massive defense industrial complex to build it or to use it effectively. We're seeing the bar lowering to not only development but use. So I'll give you an illustration in my own role in the defense industrial complex. As was mentioned, I advise a video game called Call of Duty. The cadets here will recognize it, probably no one else will. But the video game, for the game, we developed the concept, a fictional concept, of an armed quadcopter that carried a 5.56 machine gun and explosives. For a commercial for the game, we built a working version of it for a couple $1,000s. The commercial, you can see it online on YouTube, has over 11 million hits. Among the views was a US military office that looked at our working armed quadcopter drone and said, hold it, this video game company has something better than every part of the US military. It's way better than a Raven, for example, not just because it's armed, but because it can perch, stare, move around, and oh, by the way, it's flown with a tablet computer. That's the world we're already in today. And so a particular area of concern when we talk about this is not just people developing them for video games, but people using them for bad. So for example, terrorist groups. Hezbollah and Hamas have already operated unmanned aerial systems against Israel, which operates unmanned aerial systems against them. So what we're seeing is a continuance of the empowerment of individuals and small groups compared to the state. So go back to World War II. During World War II, the US did not have to worry about being bombed by the German Luftwaffe. Hitler's Air Force could not reach across the Atlantic. A couple years ago, a 77-year-old blind man built his own drone that flew itself across the Atlantic. That is, a 77-year-old blind man had greater reach than the entire Luftwaffe. And of course, he did it for a hobby. Other people might use it for ill, such as the case in America of Radwan Ferdeas. Radwan Ferdeas was a young man who was turned to terrorism, ironically enough, out of his anger over drone strikes, and he wanted to recreate the 9/11 attacks. He couldn't hijack a plane. It's very difficult today. So his plan was to get a drone, and he got one, and then load it up with explosives and fly it into the Pentagon. He got the drone. It was about the size of a small car. Fortunately for us, he asked a FBI informant, where does one get C4 explosives from? We're in that world already, where a would-be terrorist found it easier to get the drone than to get the bomb. But again, just like cars were not just used for car bombs, same thing. My vote for the most innovation last year in the field of robotics was not someone from General Atomics or AeroVironment or whatnot. It was actually a group of thieves in Taiwan who used tiny robotic helicopters equipped with pinhole cameras to carry out a $4 million jewelry heist. It's like a Hollywood movie, except they did it for real. Now, what this leads to is more questions, and I think this is very important for those of us gathered at a military academy. One of the things we know in war is that it's not how many of a technology you have or how good that technology is. It's your doctrine. It's your overall package of training and organization that truly determines who wins or loses. The problem is when it comes to doctrine with unmanned systems, as one U.S. Air Force captain put it to me, he said, quote, "It's not let's think this better, it's only give me more." It's a very powerful quote if you break it apart. It's only give me more. A couple years ago, the various military services didn't want these technologies. Now they're competing over who gets to control them. Give me more. But as that young captain said, the thing that really matters is, it's not let's think this better. So again, getting it right is huge in history. Go back to that story of the tank. The British come out of World War I with just about 12,000 tanks, almost the same exact number of unmanned ground vehicles the United States has right now. But they don't learn how to use them effectively. The Germans study them, and they are the ones who get the blitzkrieg. So what are the doctrinal questions for us? Is an unmanned system the same as a manned system? Is a drone the same as an F-16? If it is the same, then we don't have to change anything. If it's different, then what do we have to change? So for example, do we organize them along the lines of motherships, where they have centralized command and control and distributed firepower, a hub and spokes model of warfare, a point and click model of warfare? Or do we organize them the exact opposite, swarms or a wolf pack model, where we have decentralized command and control but concentrated firepower? They swarm around the target like a swarm of bees or a German submarine wolf pack from World War II. Or do they work best as teams, manned and unmanned, working together? My point here is that if we choose the right one, we figured out the robotic version of the blitzkrieg. But if we choose the wrong one, we've set our militaries in the direction of recreating the robotic version of the Maginot Line. But again, it's not just about which doctrine works best and figuring that out before the war starts, but it also is the legal ethical concerns. So for example, the swarm model may be the most effective, the decentralized command and control, because it's least vulnerable to jamming and the like, except it also presents the biggest challenges of law and ethics and accountability. Now, these ripple effects, though, go into other directions. Maybe the most important is not on the battlefield, but is off the battlefield. What is robotics doing to our politics and our democracies? Robotics take trends that are happening in our Western democracies maybe to their final ending point when it comes to the connections between the public and its wars. So in the United States and in most Western democracies right now, we don't have a draft. The last college class in the United States that had to worry about being conscripted into war just celebrated their 40th year reunion. In the United States, our Congress no longer votes to declare war. The last time the United States Congress actually formally declared a war was the spring of 1942 against Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania, the minor Axis powers that we forgot to include in the original declaration after Pearl Harbor. They were feeling left out. War bonds. During World War II, the American public personally invested over $185 billion of their own money in the war effort. If you fundraised $2 million back in World War II, you got to name your own warship. The last 10 years that we've been at war, we bought 0 war bonds, and instead we gave everybody tax breaks. The point that I'm making is that already the connections between our public and our wars, the barriers, they were already going down. Now we have a technology that literally takes those barriers to the ground. The appeal of unmanned systems is that you can send them into action without worrying about a condolence letter going to someone's father or mother. That you can carry out kinetic strikes without worrying about a pilot being killed or captured. That worry, though, can be a powerful force on the politicians who decide when and where we go to war. So we're changing the narrative, not just how politicians look at it, but how the media reports it, how the public looks at it as well. So, for example, we see this in the not-so-covert operations the United States is carrying out in places like Pakistan or Yemen. We've carried out more than 350 airstrikes into Pakistan. Yemen, we've carried out more than 60. These are of a scale that's several times the size of the Kosovo War. And yet again, not voted on by our Congress. Actually, they haven't even held a single hearing to talk about it. But it's not just covert operations involving the CIA air wing. It's also overt operations like Libya. So there's an interesting thing that played out in American politics related to the Libya campaign. We, like the rest of NATO, intervened, and the president said, we're sending in our forces to respond to a burgeoning humanitarian crisis. And then after 3 days of our manned forces being involved, we said, we're pulling out. We're handing over the risks to the rest of NATO. We're only going to be in supporting roles. So when it came time for our Congress to vote on what's called the War Powers Resolution, that is, within 60 days, if U.S. forces are operating in a military operation, Congress has to vote. That's the law. But when it came to the 60-day mark, the Obama administration said, you don't need to vote because, quote, the U.S. operations do not involve the presence of U.S. ground troops, U.S. casualties, or any serious threat thereof. That was true. But the operations did involve something else, drones. We carried out 145 airstrikes after that period where we said, Congress, don't worry your little head about voting or not on the Libya campaign. Now, let me be very clear here. I'm actually a supporter of these strikes, both the covert one and the overt one. But my worry is how this huge thing that we call war is not being treated as a war anymore, because what we've allowed is the disengagement of carrying out hostilities from the risks of doing so. Something that used to be treated as a war is not being treated like war anymore. Now, this takes on other ripple effects, such as what we're teaching here at this academy, questions of leadership. This is not just about how is it best to lead a unit now using unmanned aerial systems. I remember speaking with a U.S. Air Force colonel who commanded a Predator squadron out in Nevada, and he said, it's fundamentally different than commanding a manned unit. He found it much tougher. But there's another trend at a higher level. In the U.S., we talk about the idea of a strategic corporal, that younger and younger troops have greater and greater impact on the battlefield. But the strategic corporal has an evil twin that we don't like to talk about, the tactical general. That is, these technologies allow something that generals have always dreamed of but never could do before, to reach down into the battlefield all the way down to the point of decision on whether to fire or not. So, for example, I had an interview with a U.S. 4-star general, and he talked about how for 2 hours he watched the video feed from a single Predator. And he said, at the end of those 2 hours, I determined that the target, this was in Afghanistan, was a legitimate target. But I didn't just decide that it was a legitimate target. I even decided what size bomb to drop on that target. Now, the idea is that this technology allowed a commander to become much better informed than any commander in history. And he was proud of this because he was saying, I'm taking personal responsibility for what happens. If the strike went bad, I'd be held accountable, so why shouldn't I decide? Who better knows commander's intent than the commander himself? The problem is, for those 2 hours, that 4-star general was doing the job of a captain or a major. And it wasn't just that he couldn't do the job properly, he did it right, but he was also robbing those captains and those majors of their opportunity to make decisions so that when they're the generals, they'll have the experience to do the right thing. But this is not just about tactical generals. It's also enabling tactical politicians. We now have the ability for civilians to watch and reach down into the battlefield. Referencing how in American history, our President Johnson was lambasted for interfering with the overall bombing strategy in Vietnam, one person put it to me, quote, that what we're doing is taking LBJ all the way down to the foxhole. So go back to that air war campaign that I talked about in Pakistan, more than 350 airstrikes, not conducted by the US Air Force, conducted by a civilian intelligence agency, led by civilian officials, civilian lawyers deciding the rules of engagement or not, civilians deciding the strategy, all the way down to the target set of cards being decided by civilians. This is something that we've never seen before. But this future of war will also feature a new experience of going to war, not just for the nation, but for the individual themselves. So for 5,000 years of human history, the idea of going to war involved the same basic thing. Whether you are talking about the ancient Greeks going off to fight Troy, or my grandfather going off to fight the Japanese in the Pacific in World War II, if you went to war, you went to a place of such danger that you might never see your family again. That has always been the story of war until today. This is what a Predator pilot described of how it was like to fight insurgents in Iraq while never leaving Nevada. Quote, "You are going to war for 12 hours, shooting weapons at targets, directing kills on enemy combatants. And then you get in the car and you drive home. And 20 minutes later, you're sitting at the dinner table talking to your kids about their homework." This is a different experience of going to war. And unlike the people who describe this as a video game war, it's not that. Actually, what we're seeing is levels of stress and burnout in these units that are fighting remotely that rival stress and burnout levels among ground units deployed. It's not easy, it's just different. But well before we get to the idea of machines becoming autonomous, we're also seeing another change in the who of war, the demographics of war. Who can do what in war? Which again, technology has always done this, whether it was how the bow and arrow ended the age of the knights, to what gunpowder did to forces of nobility. One of the top pilots, so to speak, in the US military is actually a 19-year-old high school dropout in the US Army. He joined the Army to make his father proud of him again. And when the recruiting officer asked him, "What would you like to specialize in?" the young man said, "I want to be a helicopter mechanic." Army officer said, "Unfortunately, you're not qualified to be a mechanic in the US Army because you didn't finish high school. Would you like to be an unmanned aerial systems operator instead?" He turned out to be incredible. He turned out to be a natural, so to speak. He'd spent his entire life training for this because of, arguably maybe video games. He turned out to be so good that after his first deployment, they promoted him to a specialist. So for those of you not in the military, this is not a big promotion, still an enlisted man. And then they made him an instructor in the pilot training academy. I told this story at the Air Force Association National Convention. They did not like the story. You have a teenaged high school dropout enlisted man in the Army who's not just a pilot instructor right now, but he's helped take out more enemy targets, save more American lives than every single F-22 fighter pilot put together. They look at him with the same mix of kind of dismay, but also a little bit of fear as the knights looked at the peasants when the peasants got gunpowder. What are you going to do with that? Hold it. What are you going to do with that? And again, as you saw here, robotics is not just systems that operate outside us. Another change in the who of war, the demographics of war, is how it's changing us. Putting the technology inside of us, carrying it on our bodies. So one of the more powerful, I think, stories of robotics is how more than 400 American soldiers have lost arms or legs due to these IEDs, these roadside bombs, and had their lost arms or legs replaced with robotic limbs and gone back to serve in their combat units. The test to qualify to show that your robotic limb is able for you to still serve in combat is the equivalent of a triathlon. This is something that when I was growing up, we had the Star Wars movie, and our hero in it, Luke Skywalker, had his arm cut off, and in it, the movie, then he had it replaced with a robotic arm. That was science fiction when I was growing up. More than 400 American soldiers have already had that happen to them. Again, we don't stop at replacement. We look to enhancement, which we're starting to use technology in. The point that I'm making here in ending is that there are always two sides to every revolution. In English, we have the idea of Moore's law, but we also have the idea of Murphy's law. You're getting science fiction-like capabilities, but also science fiction-like questions. Human dilemmas to figure out. Now, sometimes when you speak with people in the robotics field, they say, well, these are just, as one executive at a robotics company said, these are just oops moments. When things don't work out with your robot, oops, no problem, just product recall it. Well, what are oops moments that have actually happened with robots in war so far? Sometimes the oops moments are kind of funny. Like, for example, when they were testing out a ground robot system that was equipped with a 50 caliber machine gun, it went, quote, squirrely. It started spinning in a circle and pointed its machine gun at the review stand of VIPs who were there to watch it. They were very glad that there were no bullets in the 50 caliber machine gun at the time. Other times, oops moments can be tragic. Like, for example, during a military training exercise in South Africa, an automated anti-aircraft cannon had what they called a software glitch. We've all had software glitches before where our computers don't work right. In this situation, the cannon, which was supposed to fire upwards into the sky, instead leveled and fired in a circle. It killed 9 soldiers before it ran out of ammunition. Oops. And the point is not that oops moments happen, it's how do we respond to them? Imagine you were the young officer assigned to figure out accountability for these instances. What law would you turn to for guidance? When it comes to our 21st century technologies, our 20th century laws are falling way behind. So, for example, in the field of war, we're guided by the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Conventions, though, the year they came out, the most important invention that year was the 45 RPM vinyl record player. How many people in this room still listen to music using a vinyl record player? We've got a couple lovers of old music there. It's a lot to ask of a technology, a law that's created in that period to wrestle with these new technologies. I don't mean that you throw out the old law, but it's just a major challenge for it. Most importantly, these legal issues are not just ethical issues, they go back into strategy. They go back to have huge political importance. So, for example, the idea of a new technology that had been science fiction that allowed you to attack from under the sea was called an undersea boat, a submarine. That was once science fiction, Jules Verne, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And then it became real in World War I. But the old laws of how to use this said that if you wanted to attack civilian shipping, you had to reveal yourself, hold up a flag, board the civilian ship. Well, the Germans who were using that technology said, well, that kind of kills the whole point of a submarine. We're going to attack from underneath. The United States, though, felt that the way the Germans were using this new technology was unlawful, which is why we entered World War I, and arguably why we became a superpower. A question of new technology, a question of ethics with huge political ramifications. So, bottom line here, it sounds like I've been talking about the future, but notice how every picture you saw, every example I gave you is not from the future. It's technically from the past. So what we have to deal with is not are robots going to revolt, anything like that, but are we going to stay in denial that something that looks like science fiction, seems to act like science fiction, is actually a technologic and political reality right now. Thank you. So, thank you.